Imagine a little girl whispering a desperate prayer in an empty church, begging God for one simple thing, a dad for her tired mommy. But what she never knew. A millionaire was listening from the shadows. Hook, what happens when fate hides in plain sight? The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church, casting pools of colored light across the worn wooden pews. It was a Tuesday, quiet and still, with only the distant sound of traffic reminding anyone that the world continued outside these sacred walls. Margaret Sullivan knelt in a pew near the back, her small hands pressed together in prayer. At 7 years old, she memorized the prayers her mother had taught her. But today she spoke from her heart in the simple, honest way that only children can. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the empty church. "Please help my mommy. She works so hard and she's always tired. And please, I just want a dad for mommy. Someone who will make her smile again. Someone who will stay. Amen." What Margaret didn't know was that she wasn't alone. 3 rows behind her sat Thomas Bennett, 41 years old, dressed in a navy suit that spoke of business meetings and boardrooms. He ducked into the church on impulse, seeking a moment of quiet after a particularly difficult morning of talks. He'd been sitting there, lost in his own thoughts about mergers and market shares, when the small voice had cut through his daydream. At first, he tried not to listen, respecting the child's privacy, but her words had pierced through his carefully built walls. "I just want a dad for mommy." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent the last 15 years building Bennett Industries from a small startup into a multi-million-dollar company. He'd sacrificed relationships, missed holidays, chosen work over connection time and again. At some point, he'd stopped even thinking about family, about children, about anything beyond the next deal. But this child's prayer reminded him of something he'd forgotten. The simple human need for connection, for love, for family. Hook, could one whispered wish rewrite 3 lonely lives forever? The girl stood up, smoothing down her tan dress with its slightly worn hem. She looked around the church with wide eyes, as if hoping someone had heard her prayer and might answer it immediately. Then she walked toward the door with the careful steps of a child who'd been taught to be respectful in sacred spaces. Thomas found himself standing and following her, though he wasn't entirely sure why. As they both emerged into the afternoon light, he saw a woman approaching from across the street. She had blonde hair that caught the sunlight, and she wore a simple beige dress that was clean and pressed, but clearly not new. She moved with the efficient grace of someone used to doing everything quickly, used to not having enough time. "Mama!" Margaret called out, running to her. The woman smiled, and Thomas could see the love in her expression, but also the exhaustion. She looked to be in her early 30s with a face that would have been carefree if not for the worry lines around her eyes. "There you are, sweetie," she said, taking Margaret's hand. "I finished my shift early. Were you good for Father Michael?" "Father Michael wasn't here," Margaret said. "But I said my prayers all by myself." "That's my good girl." Thomas stood there on the church steps watching them, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Excuse me," he called out. The woman turned, instinctively pulling her daughter closer. "Yes." Thomas approached slowly, not wanting to alarm her. "I'm sorry to intrude. My name is Thomas Bennett. I was in the church just now, and I couldn't help but overhear." He paused, suddenly feeling foolish. What was he doing? "Your daughter was praying." The woman's expression shifted to embarrassment, and she looked down at Margaret with gentle reproach. "Margaret, were you bothering this gentleman?" No, Thomas said quickly. "Not at all. She didn't know I was there. I was moved by her faith. And I wondered, this might sound strange, but would you and your daughter join me for coffee or ice cream, perhaps for the young lady?" The woman looked uncertain, her protective instincts clearly warring with something else. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps desperation, perhaps the simple fact that he seemed genuine. "I don't usually accept invitations from strangers," she said carefully. "Of course not. I wouldn't expect you to." Thomas pulled out his wallet and handed her a business card. "This is who I am. We could go to the cafe right across the street, very public, and if at any point you feel uncomfortable, you can leave. No questions asked? The woman studied the card. Her eyes widened slightly as she read it. Bennett Industries. You're Thomas Bennett? I am. I read about you in the paper. The education grant program you started last year. Thomas nodded. That's right. We've been funding scholarships for underprivileged students. The woman looked at her daughter, then back at Thomas. He could see her making calculations, weighing risks and possibilities. Finally, she nodded. All right, just for a little while. My name is Eleanor, by the way. Eleanor Sullivan, and this is Margaret. It's a pleasure to meet you both. The cafe was warm and welcoming with the rich smell of coffee and fresh pastries filling the air. Margaret's eyes went wide at the display case of desserts, and Thomas couldn't help but smile. Pick anything you'd like, he told her. Eleanor started to protest, but Thomas gently raised a hand. Please, it would make me happy. Margaret chose a chocolate cupcake with pink frosting, and they settled at a corner table. Thomas ordered coffee for himself and Eleanor, and for a few moments they sat in slightly awkward silence, watching Margaret carefully deconstruct her cupcake, eating the frosting first. So, Eleanor said finally, why did you really invite us here, Mr. Bennett? Thomas appreciated her directness. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I heard your daughter praying in the church, and it affected me in a way I didn't expect. Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly. What exactly did you hear? She was praying for you, for your well-being, and… Thomas hesitated, then decided on honesty. She was praying for you to find someone, a father for her. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, and Thomas saw pain flicker across her face. Margaret, sweetheart, we've talked about this. Some prayers take time to be answered. I know, Mama, Margaret said, licking frosting from her fingers. But God hears all prayers. You told me so. He does, baby. He absolutely does. Thomas found himself asking gently. If you don't mind my asking, Margaret's father. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee slowly. He left when Margaret was 2. Said he wasn't ready to be a father, that he needed to find himself or some such thing. We haven't heard from him since. She looked up at Thomas. I work 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Waitress at the diner for breakfast and lunch shifts, cleaning offices in the evening, and weekend shifts at the grocery store. Margaret stays with my neighbor, Mrs. Chin, when I'm working. She's wonderful, but… Eleanor's voice caught slightly. It's not the same as having a parent there. You're doing an incredible job, Thomas said quietly. That's clear. I'm doing the best I can, Eleanor replied. But Margaret deserves better. She deserves stability. She deserves to have someone who can go to her school plays and help with homework, and just be there. Thomas looked at the little girl, who was now trying to balance her spoon on her nose, completely absorbed in her task. He thought about his empty penthouse apartment, his 70-hour work weeks, his carefully scheduled life that left no room for spontaneity or connection. What if he heard himself say, I could help? Eleanor's guard went up immediately. Mr. Bennett, I appreciate your kindness, but we're not looking for charity. That's not what I'm offering, Thomas said, surprising himself with his certainty. Look, I know this sounds strange. We just met, but I've been thinking lately about what I'm doing with my life. About what really matters, and then I heard your daughter's prayer, and it felt like a sign, maybe. A sign of what? Thomas leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. I have more money than I know what to do with. I have a company that essentially runs itself at this point, but I don't have connection, purpose beyond profit margins. When I heard Margaret praying, it reminded me that there are things more important than business. I still don't understand what you're suggesting, Eleanor said, though her expression had softened slightly. I'm not entirely sure myself, Thomas admitted with a small laugh. But maybe we could get to know each other. No pressure, no expectations, just see what happens. I could help with Margaret, spend time with both of you, and if nothing else, you'd have someone to share the burden with, someone to call when you need help. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. You're serious? I am, but why? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. Thomas thought about how to explain it. Have you ever felt like you were sleepwalking through your life? Going through the motions, but not really living? That's where I've been for years. And then I heard a 7-year-old girl praying with such faith, such love for her mother, and it woke something up in me. It reminded me that life is about more than boardrooms and bottom lines. Margaret, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. Are you going to be my daddy? Margaret, Eleanor said, mortified. But Thomas smiled gently at the child. I don't know, Margaret. That's not something that happens overnight, but I'd like to be your friend. Would that be okay? Margaret considered this seriously, her young face thoughtful. Will you come to my school play? We're doing the 3 Little Pigs, and I'm the 3rd pig, the smart one. I would be honored to attend your school play, Thomas said solemnly. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Thomas began spending time with Eleanor and Margaret carefully and respectfully. He attended Margaret's play, sitting in the audience and clapping loudly when she took her bow. He helped Eleanor fix her car when it broke down, getting his expensive suit dirty, but not caring. He took them both to the Children's Museum on a Saturday, watching Eleanor's face light up as she relaxed for the first time in years. Eleanor was hesitant at first, her trust hard won after being abandoned. But Thomas was patient. He showed up when he said he would. He called when he was running late. He asked about her day and actually listened to the answer. He treated Margaret with kindness and respect, never trying to replace her father, but simply being present. One evening, about 2 months after their first meeting, Thomas took Eleanor to dinner while Mrs. Chen watched Margaret. It was their first time truly alone together, and Eleanor seemed nervous. You don't have to be nervous, Thomas said gently as they sat down. This is just dinner between friends. Is that what we are? Eleanor asked. Friends? Thomas looked at her. At this woman who had worked herself to exhaustion to provide for her daughter, who had maintained her dignity and her kindness despite hardship, who had slowly begun to trust him despite every reason not to. I'd like to be more than friends, he said honestly. If you're open to that, but only if it's what you want, Eleanor. Not because you need help or because I have money. Because you want to be with me. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Do you know how long it's been since someone asked what I wanted? Not what I needed or what was practical, but what I actually wanted. Tell me, Thomas said softly. I want Margaret to have a stable home. I want to be able to breathe without worrying about bills. I want, she paused, then continued with more certainty. I want to be with someone who sees me. Really sees me. Not just what I can do or provide, but who I actually am. I see you, Eleanor. Thomas said, I see a woman of incredible strength and grace. I see someone who has faced hardship and chosen love over bitterness. I see someone who has raised an extraordinary little girl despite overwhelming odds. And I see someone I could very easily fall in love with if I'm being honest. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. I think I'm already falling. 6 months later, Thomas proposed to Eleanor in the same church where Margaret had prayed. He'd arranged it with Father Michael, who had returned from his sabbatical. Margaret was there, of course, dressed in her best dress, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Eleanor Sullivan, Thomas said, kneeling before her in that sacred space. You and Margaret have changed my life in ways I never imagined possible. You've taught me what really matters. You've shown me that success isn't measured in dollars, but in moments of connection, in laughter, in love. Will you marry me? Will you let me be the father Margaret prayed for and the partner you deserve? Eleanor, tears streaming down her face, nodded. Yes, yes, absolutely yes. Margaret let out a squeal of delight, and ran to hug them both. God answered my prayer. I told you he would, Mama. You certainly did, baby, Eleanor said, laughing and crying at the same time. Thomas picked Margaret up, holding her as Eleanor wrapped her arms around both of them. Thank you for praying, he whispered to the little girl. Thank you for having faith. That's what prayers are for, Margaret said with the simple wisdom of childhood. To help God know what we need. The wedding was small and beautiful, held in the same church 3 months later. Thomas had offered to arrange something elaborate, but Eleanor had wanted something intimate, just family and close friends. Margaret was the flower girl, taking her role very seriously and walking down the aisle with perfect precision. In his vows, Thomas spoke about unexpected blessings and answered prayers. I walked into a church looking for a moment of quiet, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I walked out having found my purpose. Eleanor, you and Margaret have given me a family, but more than that, you've given me a reason to be the man I always wanted to be. Eleanor's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. You showed up, she said. When I had every reason to not trust, to not hope, you showed up, and you kept showing up, and now I know you'll keep showing up for the rest of our lives. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for being the answer to a little girl's prayer. They moved into a house together, not Thomas's sterile penthouse, but a real home with a yard where Margaret could play and a kitchen where they could cook together. Thomas cut back his hours at work, delegating more and trusting his team. He discovered the joy of helping with homework, of reading bedtime stories, of attending parent-teacher conferences and weekend soccer games. Eleanor went back to school, pursuing the teaching degree she'd always dreamed of, because now she had the time and support to do it. She discovered she loved teaching kindergarten, loved seeing the world through children's eyes, loved shaping young minds, and Margaret thrived. She had a father who came to every school play, who helped her build science fair projects, who taught her that dreams were worth pursuing. She had a mother who was rested and happy, who could finally be present instead of constantly worried. She had a family. Years later, when Margaret was a teenager, she found Thomas sitting in his study one evening, looking at a framed photograph from their wedding day. Dad, she said, and the words still warmed Thomas's heart every time he heard it. Can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. Do you remember that day we met in the church? Every detail, Thomas said. Did you really hear my prayer? Or did Mama tell you later what I'd said? Thomas smiled. I really heard it, Margaret. I heard every word. What were you doing there in the church? I mean, Thomas considered the question. I was lost, he said finally. Not physically, but in every other way that matters. I had everything I thought I wanted, but I was empty inside. And then I heard you praying with such faith, such love, and it woke me up. It reminded me what life is really about. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. I'm glad you were there. I'm glad God made sure you heard. So am I, sweetheart. So am I. Can I tell you a secret? Margaret asked. Always. When I prayed that day, I wasn't just asking for a dad for Mama. I was asking for a dad for me, too. But I didn't say that part out loud because I didn't want to be selfish. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He stood and hugged his daughter close. That wouldn't have been selfish, Margaret. That would have been honest. And for what it's worth, I got exactly what I needed, too. A daughter who changed my life. A family that gave me purpose. Margaret hugged him back tightly. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know. That night, lying in bed beside Eleanor, Thomas reflected on the improbable chain of events that had brought them together. A child's prayer in an empty church. A moment of vulnerability, a willingness to take a chance on something uncertain. What are you thinking about? Eleanor asked, snuggling closer. Just how grateful I am, Thomas said. How lucky we are. Not luck, Eleanor said softly. Faith, love, and answered prayers. And somewhere in heaven, perhaps a benevolent force smiled, knowing that sometimes the most profound answers to prayers come not through miracles or divine intervention, but through the simple willingness of human hearts to open, to trust, and to love. Because that's the real miracle in the end. Not that God answers prayers, but that He works through ordinary people, giving them the courage to be extraordinary for each other, to show up, to stay, to love without reservation. Margaret had prayed for a father for her mother. But what she'd really prayed for was family, connection, love, home. And in that small church on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon with stained glass windows casting colored light across worn wooden pews, her prayer had been heard and answered.